Emotional collapse feels like regression because the mind measures growth by function. If you can work, speak clearly, respond normally, and keep your rhythm, you assume you're stable. When those capacities suddenly weaken, the mind concludes that something valuable is being lost. But collapse is often not the loss of growth, it is the loss of compensation. For a long time, many people do not live from integration, they live from force. They hold themselves together through discipline, pressure, vigilance, over-explanation, usefulness, and the constant management of inner tension. This can look strong from the outside because it produces visible function, but function is not always health. Sometimes function is what the system uses to delay a reckoning. That is why collapse often arrives after a period of apparent progress. A person becomes more aware, more honest, more reflective, and then suddenly less able to carry what they once carried. This seems backwards until you understand the mechanism. Awareness removes numbness, and numbness was doing structural labor. Once the dulling effect weakens, the true weight of what has been carried becomes visible. What breaks first is usually not the soul, but the arrangement. The arrangement is the internal pattern that kept pain compartmentalized enough for daily life to continue. It may have kept grief in one room, anger in another, exhaustion under the floorboards, fear behind achievement, and loneliness beneath constant activity. As long as those rooms stayed sealed, life could appear coherent. Collapse begins when the walls stop obeying. This is why emotional collapse can feel disproportionate. A small event triggers a massive response: a delayed text, a difficult conversation, an ordinary disappointment, and suddenly the body floods, the mind spirals, and the heart feels unable to recover its shape. The event itself is rarely the full cause. It is simply where the overstressed structure finally loses its grip. Most people misread this moment because they focus on the trigger instead of the load. They ask why something so small affected them so deeply. The better question is, what was already being held that made even a small impact unbearable? Collapse is usually not proof of fragility in the moment. It is proof of cumulative strain that has exceeded the old carrying method. There is also a timing problem in how people understand breakdowns. They assume healing should reduce intensity immediately. But sometimes healing increases intensity because it increases access. You begin to feel what your system had postponed. You begin to remember what your body had locked away behind productivity or emotional control. The collapse is not always new pain arriving. It is often old pain losing its sedation. This is why collapse can happen after a person becomes safer, not only when life becomes worse. When the system no longer has to spend every ounce of energy surviving the outside, it starts releasing what survival kept frozen inside. The mind resists this because it wants reward for endurance. It wants safety to feel light. But safety often feels heavy before it feels spacious, because frozen material thaws before it leaves. Many people also confuse collapse with failure, because they still imagine growth as a straight line upward. They expect maturity to look increasingly polished, increasingly calm, increasingly consistent. Yet real transformation often interrupts image before it restores depth. It may make someone less impressive for a season, less available, less composed, less willing to perform certainty while something more honest is being rebuilt. That season is dangerous, partly because others may not understand it either. They may encourage quick stabilization. They may praise the old functioning self and worry about the current one. They may ask what happened, as if the visible unraveling is the problem rather than the hidden strain that came before it. This can push a person to restart performance too early. An early performance often reburies what collapse was trying to expose. What collapse is doing at its deepest level is withdrawing false support. It is showing you which parts of your life were being held together by self-abandonment, emotional suppression, chronic over-effort, or unprocessed fear. That does not make collapse pleasant. It can be humiliating, disorienting, and deeply lonely, but its intelligence lies in what it refuses to let continue. You may notice this in very ordinary ways. You cannot tolerate certain conversations you used to absorb. You cannot push through exhaustion the way you once did. You cannot pretend agreement without your body protesting afterward. You cannot keep volunteering your nervous system as the bridge for everyone else's comfort. What used to feel manageable now feels costly, and that rising cost is part of the reorganization. This is where perspective has to change if healing is going to deepen. Instead of asking how to become functional again as quickly as possible, you begin asking what kind of function was built on distortion. Instead of asking how to get rid of the collapse, you begin asking what truth the collapse is enforcing. Instead of treating it only as interruption, you start seeing it as instruction. That shift does not solve the pain immediately, but it changes the way you stand inside it. The body becomes very important here because collapse is not just emotional content. It is a physiological event. Sleep changes, appetite changes, tolerance changes, focus changes, and the body begins speaking in thresholds rather than ideals. It tells you what it can no longer carry, what it can no longer fake, and what it now requires if coherence is going to replace survival. That does not mean every collapse is sacred or that every breakdown should simply be romanticized. Some collapses reveal where additional support is needed, where trauma is still active, where the nervous system is overloaded beyond what insight alone can regulate. But even then, the deeper principle remains. A breakdown is not automatically evidence that you are moving backward. Sometimes it is the first honest evidence that the old way of holding yourself together is no longer permitted. Once this becomes clear, a different kind of compassion becomes possible. Not the shallow compassion that says everything is fine when it is not, but the steadier compassion that recognizes reorganization without demanding immediate elegance. You stop expecting yourself to look polished while your inner architecture is being rebuilt. You stop treating every surge of emotion as a betrayal of your path. And you begin to understand why some of the most important phases of awakening look from the outside like the exact opposite of mastery. Over time, you may start noticing that collapse has patterns. It tends to appear where there is repeated inner contradiction. It tends to intensify where truth has been delayed. It tends to revisit the same domains until the underlying structure changes rather than the surface response. This means collapse is not random chaos. It is pressure gathering around what cannot remain divided forever. And once you begin seeing that pattern, something else becomes possible. You no longer have to wait for total breakdown to take your inner world seriously. You begin listening earlier. You begin responding to strain before it becomes crisis. You begin treating your own thresholds as meaningful rather than inconvenient. That is where collapse starts transforming from something that only happens to you into something that teaches you how to live before the next wave has to force the lesson harder. Once you stop interpreting collapse as failure, another question appears almost immediately. If the old form of functioning was built on suppression, what does a healthier form of stability actually look like? Many people know how to hold themselves together through pressure, but they do not yet know how to live together through truth. That is why the period after collapse can feel strangely empty. The old engine is no longer trusted, but the new one has not yet been built. This is where people become vulnerable to imitation healing. They learn better language, better insights, better nervous system terms, but they still use all of it to force themselves back into acceptable performance. The person may appear softer, wiser, more emotionally aware, yet the inner logic remains unchanged. They are still trying to become manageable rather than integrated. Collapse returns when the body realizes it is being asked to wear a more spiritual version of the same armor. A real reorganization changes the mechanism, not just the story. It changes how decisions are made, how energy is measured, how rest is treated, how truth is spoken, and how limits are honored before crisis makes them undeniable. This is why genuine rebuilding often looks slower than people expect. Slowness is not always hesitation. Sometimes slowness is accuracy replacing force. You may notice this most clearly in ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. A person who is reorganizing may leave earlier, cancel sooner, pause longer before answering, or admit uncertainty without rushing to correct it. These actions do not look impressive in the usual sense. They do not create the appearance of momentum, but they show that the system is no longer sacrificing internal coherence for external continuity. That shift matters because emotional collapse is not only about what was felt, it is about what was ignored. Many people do not collapse because they are too emotional. They collapse because they have been overriding emotional information for too long. Feelings were treated as interruptions rather than intelligence, so the system had to escalate from whisper to pain. Once it escalates, healing is not simply about expressing more. It is about learning to listen sooner. Listening sooner changes the entire architecture of recovery. You stop waiting for despair to make rest legitimate. You stop waiting for shutdown to make boundaries obvious. You stop waiting for resentment to reveal that your yes was never true. This is one of the quietest but most significant movements in real healing. Your thresholds stop being treated like inconveniences and start being treated like information. At first, this can feel deeply unfamiliar because many people were shaped in environments where internal signals were not centered. Their value came from responsiveness, usefulness, endurance, flexibility, and emotional containment. If that was the training, then honoring your own limit can feel selfish before it feels sane. The nervous system may even panic when you begin saying no earlier, resting sooner, or declining roles that once defined you. That panic does not mean the change is wrong. It often means the old identity is losing authority. This is why collapse can unsettle a person's image of themselves more than their actual life. They may have built an identity around being dependable, calm, thoughtful, resilient, spiritually mature, or endlessly available. When collapse interrupts those traits, it can feel like a moral injury. They do not just feel overwhelmed. They feel ashamed of no longer matching their own self-concept. But shame often enters where image is breaking faster than truth is settling. That is an important moment to understand clearly. The collapse is not trying to humiliate you. It is revealing how much of your self-respect was tied to maintaining a role, even when that role cost you deeply. If your worth depended on staying composed, then disorganization will feel like disgrace. If your worth depended on being needed, then withdrawal will feel like betrayal. But worth that can only survive under strain is not worth that has been rooted deeply enough. This is also where support becomes more complex than comfort. Comfort wants the pain reduced quickly. Support wants the structure understood accurately. Some people can soothe you while still helping you remain honest. Others can only soothe you by encouraging a fast return to the old version of yourself. That difference matters, because after collapse, the system is impressionable. It is deciding whether to rebuild around truth or rebuild around image. You may start noticing this difference in your own instincts too. Part of you wants relief, and that is natural. But another part wants to understand why this happened in the exact way it did, because without that understanding, relief becomes temporary. The body remembers patterns that the mind prefers to rename. So if the pattern is not actually changed, collapse becomes cyclical. It does not repeat because healing failed. It repeats because the structure beneath the experience remained intact. This is where emotional collapse becomes one of the most direct teachers of hidden structure. It shows you where your life still depends on chronic overriding. It shows you where you still perform energy you do not have. It shows you where your peace depends on everyone else staying predictable. It shows you where your worth still gets borrowed from usefulness, from composure, from being the one who can absorb more than others. Collapse names these dependencies by making them unsustainable. There is also a deeper perspective that begins to emerge once the first layer of survival shame softens. You start to realize that collapse did not only remove false support, it interrupted false timing. Many people live as if they can postpone truth indefinitely, as if the body will wait forever, as if emotional debt can be carried without interest. Collapse reveals that this is not how the system works. What is delayed is still accumulating, and what accumulates eventually demands form. Seen this way, collapse is not simply an ending. It is a correction in timing. It brings forward what the person kept placing later, after the project, after the relationship stabilizes, after the family calms down, after the next breakthrough, after one more season of endurance. The problem is that later becomes a hiding place. Collapse removes the hiding place by making the postponed reality too loud to delay again. This can feel cruel until you understand the implication more fully. A life built on permanent postponement cannot become coherent. It can only become efficient at self-division. So collapse interrupts not because the system is against you, but because some deeper intelligence in you has decided that division can no longer be your normal. That decision may not feel graceful at first. It may feel like disorder, inconvenience, embarrassment, even loss. But underneath those experiences is something more exact. A refusal has occurred. That refusal changes what becomes possible afterward. It does not make life easy, but it makes certain falsities harder to maintain. You begin to sense more quickly when you are about to agree against yourself. You begin to feel more immediately when a role is draining more than it gives. You begin to recognize the difference between a challenge that helps you grow and a strain that slowly empties you. These distinctions are not dramatic, but they are foundational. Over time, this is how a new form of steadiness begins. Not the old steadiness of emotional suppression dressed up as maturity, but a steadiness that can actually include truth. It is quieter than performance and often less visible from the outside. It may involve fewer promises, fewer heroic recoveries, fewer displays of composure. Yet it carries more substance because it is not being funded by denial. It is built through repeated alignment between what is felt, what is known, and what is actually chosen. When that kind of steadiness begins to take shape, emotional collapse starts to look different in memory. You do not see it only as the moment you fell apart. You start to see it as the moment the old method lost its unquestioned status. It becomes a threshold where image stopped being enough, where compensation stopped being impressive, where your body stopped agreeing to be the silent container for everything your life refused to name. And once that threshold has been crossed, the next question becomes less about how to avoid breaking down and more about what kind of life no longer requires being held together by fracture. What changes after that realization is not merely your interpretation of collapse, but your relationship to responsibility. Before, responsibility may have meant carrying more, enduring more, accommodating more, and proving that your inner world would never interfere with your outer reliability. After collapse is understood more clearly, responsibility starts to mean something else. It starts to mean not building a life that constantly demands your self-erasure in exchange for your sense of worth. That is a far less dramatic definition, but it is usually the one that matters. You may notice that this new responsibility feels strange because it does not flatter the ego in the same way. Endurance can look noble. Overriding can look mature. Being the one who keeps everything moving can look like strength. But much of that strength is expensive in ways that do not show immediately, and collapse is often the invoice arriving late. Once you understand that, you begin to care less about appearing strong and more about whether your strength is actually sustainable. This is where a person begins rebuilding from a different principle, not from the question of how to become unbreakable, but from the question of what kind of structure does not require chronic internal violence. That question changes everything because it moves the focus away from emergency repair and toward design. You stop asking only how to recover from collapse. You start asking what patterns make collapse more likely, what environments normalize self-neglect, and what habits quietly turn strain into identity. In lived experience, this often begins with a simpler honesty than people expect. You admit that certain things cost you more than you wanted to believe. You admit that your body has been telling the truth earlier than your mind allowed. You admit that there are relationships where your calm was actually suppression, and routines where your consistency was actually disassociation. These recognitions do not always create immediate action, but they begin changing the atmosphere in which future action will arise. That atmosphere matters because collapse is rarely transformed by one grand decision. More often, it is transformed by repeated smaller decisions that interrupt the old logic. You rest before you are incapacitated. You tell the truth before resentment has to say it for you. You step back before overload has to force a shutdown. At first, these choices may feel underwhelming, yet over time they create an entirely different relationship to strain. There is a mechanism behind this that is easy to miss. The nervous system learns not only from crisis, but from repeated experiences of congruent. Each time you respond to your own signal without betrayal, you teach the system that honesty does not have to wait until collapse. Each time you honor a threshold before it becomes catastrophic, you reduce the amount of force required for your inner world to be heard. This is one reason healing can eventually feel steadier even when life remains complex. The system no longer has to scream to get your attention. You may also notice that emotional collapse begins revealing a difference between intensity and depth. Many people confuse the two because collapse is undeniably intense. But intensity alone does not transform anything. Depth emerges when the collapse is understood accurately enough to change the structure that produced it. Without that depth, people often become trapped in a cycle where every breakdown feels meaningful, yet nothing fundamental actually shifts. With depth, even quieter changes begin carrying more consequence than dramatic reactions ever did. This can be humbling in the best way. You realize that some of the most important healing is not loud, and some of the most powerful rebuilding is not visible. It may simply be the decision to stop forcing conversations when your body is already done. It may be the recognition that your peace cannot depend on never disappointing anyone. It may be the understanding that certain forms of achievement are too expensive if they require permanent emotional exile. None of these changes create an impressive story quickly, but they create a different future slowly. That slower future is often where people begin to feel disoriented again, because it does not carry the same adrenaline as survival. Survival provides urgency, and urgency gives a person a feeling of purpose. When collapse interrupts survival mode, there can be a season where life feels less dramatic, but also less defined. You are no longer busy holding the structure together, but you are not yet fully fluent in living from something more integrated. This in-between phase can be mistaken for flatness, when it is often the nervous system learning how to exist without constant emergency. What becomes important here is not to confuse the absence of old urgency with the absence of aliveness. In fact, many people only discover how much of their former energy was driven by anxiety once that anxiety begins to release. They may initially feel less motivated, less certain, less outwardly dynamic, but beneath that apparent loss, something more precise may be forming. Energy that is no longer fueled by panic can begin to reorganize around meaning instead of mere momentum. This is also where emotional collapse changes how you understand trust. Before, trust may have meant trusting yourself to push through, to stay composed, to recover quickly, to handle what comes. Afterward, trust begins to take on different form. It becomes trust that you will listen sooner, tell the truth earlier, and respond to strain with intelligence rather than self-accusation. That kind of trust is less glamorous, but it is more intimate. It is built not on heroics, but on repeated refusal to abandon yourself. Once that trust deepens, collapse itself starts to lose some of its old symbolism. It no longer stands only for breaking down. It becomes part of a wider language your system has been speaking all along. Smaller forms of contraction, fatigue, irritability, numbness, confusion, overstimulation, and sudden emotional flooding begin to make more sense as early dialects of the same message. You begin understanding that collapse was not the first sign. It was simply the point at which the quieter signs had been ignored too long. That realization has a profound implication for how you live going forward. You stop building your self-respect around how much discomfort you can deny. You stop interpreting overwhelm as a personal flaw that must be hidden before it becomes visible. You stop admiring forms of resilience that are actually just socially rewarded self-neglect. Gradually, your standards change. Not your standards for excellence in the shallow sense, but your standards for what kind of life is worthy of being called coherent. You may then begin to see collapse in others differently too. Not as weakness, not as dramatic failure, and not as something to romanticize, but as a moment when an unsustainable arrangement becomes visible. This can make you gentler without making you vague. You become less impressed by polished functioning when you can feel the cost beneath it. You also become less alarmed when someone looks temporarily less put together, because you know that disorganization can sometimes be a more honest sign than performance. There is a wider perspective here that many people only notice later. Emotional collapse is not merely about your inner state. It is also about the systems you are trying to live inside. Some families normalize suppression. Some workplaces reward chronic override. Some communities praise spiritual calm while quietly punishing honest disruption. If collapse happens within those systems, it is not only your private burden, it may also be evidence that the surrounding structure depends on forms of self-betrayal you can no longer sustain. That does not mean every system must be abandoned, but it does mean you start evaluating environments by different criteria. You begin asking not only whether something is meaningful, productive, loyal, or spiritually interesting. You ask whether it requires fragmentation to function. You ask whether your body consistently tightens around it. You ask whether your presence is welcome only when it is edited. These questions emerge naturally once collapse has taught you the price of staying in arrangements that praise your output while disregarding your wholeness. Over time, this shifts the entire meaning of progress. Progress is no longer just becoming more capable. It becomes becoming less divided. It becomes needing less force to stay aligned with what you know. It becomes creating fewer conditions in which collapse has to arrive as the final messenger. This is quieter work than people often imagine, but it is also more honest, because it is rooted in the actual mechanics of how suffering accumulates and how coherence is built. So emotional collapse is not regression simply because it interrupts your previous rhythm. It may be the exact moment your system refuses to keep financing a life through suppression, pressure, and delayed truth. It may be the threshold where your body stops agreeing to carry what your image still wants to deny. And once you begin living from that understanding, the question changes again. You stop asking how to get back to the person who could hold everything together, and you start listening for the shape of a life that would no longer require being held together that way at all.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.